Chapter 4. Who Killed the Most People? Socialists, Capitalists, or Marxists? Democracy is the road to socialism. Karl Marx. Late at night, on January 5, 1972, about 200 soldiers, airmen, sailors, and Marines were dropped off at Kadena Air Base on the island of Okinawa, Japan. Kadena Airfield had been a Japanese airfield during World War II, and Okinawa had been the site of some of the fiercest fighting, just before the end of the war with Japan. Groggy, without much sleep and passing through time zones, I found my way to the officers' mess hall for breakfast. The mess hall was buzzing as I searched for a seat. No one looked up. No one said hello. I was ignored. There was only one open seat, so I carried my tray of food to that table and sat down next to another pilot who also ignored me. I did my best to break the ice and talk to the person next to me, rather than respond to my questions. He just mumbled unintelligible responses. Finally, I asked a question that was on everyone's mind. Tapping him on his shoulder, I asked, "When do you rotate back to the States?" Flashing the biggest smile I have ever seen, he turned and shouted out loud, so the entire mess hall could hear, "I'm going home on the plane you came in on." The entire room broke out into roars of laughter. I had been set up. I was the F&G, the FING new guy, his replacement pilot for the squadron, still grinning from ear to ear. The Marine picked up his bag and said, "I'll be sleeping in my own bed with my wife tonight. Welcome to the war." He turned and headed for the plane I had come in on. That pilot and I remain close friends to this day. We were both stationed in Hawaii, at Kanoe Marine Corps Air Station, when I rotated back a year later. The day our plane was met by anti-war protesters in California, Composite Squadron. On the island of Okinawa, the Marine Squadron was preparing for a float, short for flotilla. A flotilla is a group of 7 war ships built around an aircraft carrier. The carrier was to be our squadron's home in the war zone. While on Okinawa, we were integrating into a composite squadron. Until then, I had been assigned to a single aircraft squadron. I had come from a gunship squadron that had trained at Camp Pendleton, California. The new composite squadron, HMM 164, was made up of CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters, often called a Jolly Green Giant. This is a CH-46C Knight, a medium troop transport helicopter, and the UH-1 Huey gunship, flying as a team. The focus of our training on Okinawa was to learn to fly together, to fly and fight as a team of different types of aircraft. This was not as easy as it might sound. The jobs of CH-53 and CH-46 were to insert as many troops into a LZ, a landing zone, as quickly as possible. The job of the Huey gunship was to fly guns and rocket support, suppressive fire, while the CH-53s and CH-40Xs sat on the ground, discharging or picking up Marines in battle. Obviously, I liked the job of the gunships far more than the transport helicopters. The thought of sitting on the ground, waiting while Marines were discharging or loading, did not appeal to me. I preferred flying and firing rockets and machine guns. On Okinawa, we practiced flying in formation, often 2 CH-53s and 4 CH-40Xs with 2 gunships as escorts. We flew in at 1,500 feet. The altitude was important because it was above the effective range of small arms fire, such as the Viet Cong's Chinese and Russian-made AK-47s. The war had changed. Just before we were aboard the ships of the battle group, we received word that we had to change our tactics. The NVA and Viet Cong now had the Russian-made SA-7, a shoulder-held rocket with infrared technology. The intelligence officer of our new composite squadron stood up and said, "Gentlemen, the war has changed. We can no longer fly into battle at 1,500 feet. We must now fly in at treetop level." This changed everything. It was challenging enough flying in at 1,500 feet. Our squadron now had to learn how to fly in tight formation and fight from just above the trees. This change was especially tough for gunship pilots because we had been taught to fire from 1,500 feet. The SA-7 gave the soldier on the ground an unfair advantage. The soldier on the ground no longer needed to be a good shot. They did not need much training. All he or she had to do was point and shoot. The infrared guidance system picked up the heat from our exhaust and would fly right up our tailpipe, blowing us out of the sky. Our squadron left Okinawa and sailed to Vietnam, unprepared for what lay ahead. Technology had made our training obsolete. The price of death. It cost the United States several $1 million and a few years to train an aircrew. It then cost about $1 million for the 2 pilots, 2 gunners, and a crew chief to fly the aircraft. And it took about $1 billion to deliver our squadron to the war zone on a flotilla of 7 warships. Technology now gave a single person, man, woman, even a child without any training, the power to fire a $100 shoulder-held rocket and blow our aircraft out of the sky. Inexpensive technology killed us. Our years of education and training were now obsolete. If we want to survive, much less from the war, we had to relearn, retrain, and practice flying differently as a composite squadron of different aircraft with different missions. The VC required less training. They just need to point and shoot. Technology had lowered the cost of war for the VC and made war extremely expensive for America. Feet dry. Our flotilla of ships was soon on station off Vietnam. All we did was wait, train, and watch movies. It was boring. If we flew, our missions were just resupply, fly into Da Nang for whatever our commanding officers wanted. Then, suddenly, activity began to pick up. We flew more. We were flying for different reasons. In April of 1972, I radioed back to the carrier. Feet dry. Feet dry meant that our flight of 3 aircraft, 2 CH-40 SXS and 1 gunship, had flown about 15 miles from the carrier and had now crossed the beach. Our flight of 3 banked to the right and flew north over some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. It had been 6 years since I was in Vietnam. In 1966, I was here as a 19-year-old midshipman, a Kings Point student from my sea year on board a rusty bomb-carrying cargo ship. In 1966, the war was just beginning to escalate from a small rebellion into a full-blown war. In 1966, our cargo ship was swinging on the hook, which meant we were at anchor at Cam Ranh Bay, a large military harbor. The only action we saw or heard was from U.S. Army guards stationed on our ship, dropping grenades over the side every half hour to prevent frogmen from attaching explosives to the hull of our ship. We were allowed to go ashore every day for food, cold beer, and other diversions. In 1966, all I saw were tiny fishing villages. The Vietnamese I met were warm, friendly, wonderful people. They did not seem to want to kill me, and I did not want to kill them. It did not seem like a war zone. In 1972, as a 25-year-old, I noticed even from the air the changes caused by years of war. Flying low-level over the pristine beaches, we soon came upon one spectacular French chateaus that were now bombed out, destroyed. Vietnam was once known as the Indochina Riviera, and I could see why. The colonial French had a great lifestyle in Vietnam. It was sad and surreal to see these once grand chateaus and imagine what life was like before the war, before the communists decided to take Vietnam back from the French. Chateaus of the rich. As I flew along the beach, passing the blackened, bombed out, and looted French chateaus of the rich, my mind drifted back to my teacher at Kings Point, the B-17 pilot. His lessons on Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, and Mao were playing out like a movie right in front of me as our flight of 3 aircraft flew toward the city of Hue, once the capital of Vietnam. I fixated on a beautiful yellow chateau, now bombed and blackened. Only a few years earlier, it had obviously been the home of a very rich family. I wondered what life must have been like for the family, and imagined that there were probably galas and parties and beautifully dressed people. Now it was a memory of times past. The philosophies of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao were winning. Thinking of the lessons of my economics teacher at Kings Point, I wondered if I was looking at the future of America burning. In 2020, I watched television coverage of the city of Portland, Oregon burning. It was a city where Kim and I had once lived. Then I drove past a boarded-up Neiman Marcus store near my office in Scottsdale, Arizona, and those images brought back memories of that yellow French chateau in Vietnam. And I could hear Khrushchev's warning. You Americans are so gullible. No, you won't accept communism outright, but we will keep feeding you small doses of socialism until you'll finally wake up and find you already have communism. an ancient capital. The ancient imperial city of Hue had remained untouched through most of the war until the French gave up and left Vietnam. As the ancient imperial capital and cradle of Vietnamese history and culture, Hue stood as a tremendous psychological prize in the struggle for control of that beleaguered country. The Battle of Hue, from January 31st to March 2nd, 1968, and also called the Siege of Hue, was a major military engagement in the Tet Offensive launched by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. After initially losing control of most of Hue and its surroundings, the combined South Vietnamese and American forces gradually recaptured the city during 1 month of intense fighting. I'll never date a Marine again. As our flight of 3 approached the once beautiful, now bombed ancient city of Hue, I thought about a young woman who had turned me down for a date. I met her while I was in advanced weapons training at Camp Pendleton, California. She had been engaged to a Marine lieutenant, and they had planned on getting married when he returned from Vietnam. Tragically, he was killed at the Battle of Hue during the Tet Offensive in 1968. She was a friend of a friend, and every time I asked her out, she would respond politely and with deep sadness, saying, "I'll never date Marine again." And as far as I know, she never did, and she never married. The wound in her heart never healed. America was winning. In 1972, my co-pilot and I played tourist and visited the more famous battle sites of Hue. Our guide was a South Vietnamese Marine major who fought alongside the U.S. Marines in taking back Hue. It was with the same deep sadness that I had seen the young woman who'd lost her love that our guide said, "The battle for Hue was a turning point." The Tet Offensive of 1968 broke the back of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. America was winning. "What happened?" my co-pilot asked. The American press turned against America. After Tet, American journalists reported and photographed atrocity after atrocity, turning Americans against the war just as America was winning. Your journalists showed the atrocities committed by your side, but not the atrocities of the VC. They reported nothing about the bravery of your young men, and there were many very brave young Americans. Your doctors and nurses in field hospitals were saints. But your press made America look like the enemy. Your press won the war for the communists. Just then, a U.S. Army Jeep pulled up, and 2 American civilians stepped out. "Are you Marines?" asked one of them. "Yes, we are," my co-pilot replied. "Who are you?" "We're reporters." "What are you Marines doing here?" "Fighting a war," I said sarcastically. "Marines are not supposed to be here," the reporter stated. "I know. We're not here," smirked my co-pilot. "We'll be back on board our carrier tonight. As long as we do not remain in Vietnam overnight, technically we're not here." "What carrier?" asked one of the reporters. My co-pilot and I went silent. We knew the reporters wanted to know what ship we were off of, what squadron, why we were on land, and most importantly, who was our passenger. So we shut up. Our passenger was a 1-star Marine general, and the other passengers in the 2nd aircraft were his staff. The general and his staff were in Hue planning the next offensive, an offensive that would become known as the Second Battle for Quang Tri. The 2 reporters were insistent, intimidating. They wanted to know more than they needed to know, and more than we were willing to share. Although the 4 of us were all Americans, it was clear to me that we were not on the same side. We flipped the reporters our middle fingers and turned as we continued our tour of Hue with the Vietnamese major. The battle for Quang Tri. We flew the 1-star Marine general back to our battle group, and the planning for the next battle began. As we are taught, parabellum, if you want peace, prepare for war. The battle for Quang Tri began on June 28, 1972, and lasted 81 days until September 16th. During the second battle for Quang Tri, South Vietnam's army, ERVN, defeated the North Vietnamese army, PAVN, at the ancient citadel at Quang Tri. Bitter memories. I mentioned the battle's victories and the price paid at Hue and Quang Tri during the Tet Offensive in 1968 because America was winning in Vietnam. We paid the price of war, in blood, death, and broken hearts. The bitterness amongst many U.S. Vietnam vets stems from the realization that America defeated America. American media turned Americans against our troops in the field. That realization made me take a hard look at the definition of treason, the crime of betraying one's country. If you have a chance to talk to a Vietnam veteran, ask him what it felt like to have his country turn against him. Academic elites. America's academic elite, our incompetent leaders in Washington, D.C., killed more American troops than the Viet Cong and NBA, as Thomas Sowell states. Brainy folks were also present in Lyndon Johnson's administration, especially in the Pentagon, where Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara is brilliant, was kids tried to micromanage the Vietnam War, with disastrous results. At Kings Point, our economics teacher had our class study Alfred, Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Here's how Wikipedia describes that poem. The Charge of the Light Brigade was a failed military action involving the British Light Cavalry led by Lord Cardigan against Russian forces during the Battle of Balaclava on October 25, 1854, in the Crimean War. Lord Raglan had intended to send the Light Brigade to prevent the Russians from removing captured guns from overrun Turkish positions, a task for which the Light Cavalry were well suited. However, there was miscommunication in the chain of command, and the Light Brigade was instead sent on a frontal assault against a different artillery battery, one well prepared with excellent fields of defensive fire. The Light Brigade reached the battery under withering direct fire and scattered some of the gunners, but they were forced to retreat immediately, and the assault ended with very high British casualties and no decisive gains. The events were the subject of Alfred, Lord Tennyson's narrative poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1854, published just 6 weeks after the event. Its lines emphasize the valor of the cavalry in bravely carrying out their orders, regardless of the nearly inevitable outcome. Responsibility for the miscommunication has remained controversial, as the order was vague and Lewis Edward Nolan delivered the written orders with some verbal interpretation, then died in the first minute of the assault. Teaching leadership. Kings Point has been recognized as one of the top schools for teaching leadership. Our economics teacher spent many hours teaching leadership by having students discuss poems such as Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, a poem on the price of a leader's miscommunication to his troops. Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. All in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade. Charge the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though. The soldier knew someone had blundered. There's not to make reply. There's not a reason why. There's but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them. Cannon to left of them. Cannon in front of them volleyed and thundered. Stormed it with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well into the jaws of death. Into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabers bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabering the gunners there, charging an army, while all the world wondered, plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian, reeled from the saber stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them volleyed and thundered, stormed it with shot and shell. While horse and hero fell, that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600, when can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made! All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the Light Brigade, noble 600. U.S. corporate fake media, the liberal elite of Silicon Valley, and the NEA should study this poem. It makes more sense than critical race theory and gender pronouns. America and the world are in need of leaders who unite with courage rather than leaders who divide with hate. Into the valley of death. In 1972, the Battle of Quang Tri was the first major offensive in which our squadron engaged. Due to a policy of Vietnamization, which meant teaching the Vietnamese to fight for themselves, the South Vietnamese did most of the ground fighting. The U.S. Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marines fought in support. The Air Force dropped bombs in their B-52s. The Navy fired their 16-inch cannons from their ships, and the Army Cobra helicopters flew in close ground support. Our Marine squadron provided the large helicopter troop transports to deliver the South Vietnamese Marines into the zone. As I've stated earlier, the NVA had a new weapon, the SA-7, a shoulder-fired, heat-seeking rocket. As I've said, as pilots, We knew our training was obsolete. Our new flying tactics were untested. In theory, it all sounded good, but we would now be tested, flying and fighting from treetop level, at Camp Pendleton during advanced weapons training. The first time I flew an aircraft with machine guns and rockets, we had been trained to fight flying in from 1,500 feet, above enemy small arms fire. From 1,500 feet, pilots have more time and can see everything. At treetop level, everything changes. Aircraft are closer, response time is measured in split seconds, and communication must be more precise. During one of the battles of Quang Tri, the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Army pounded the LZ, the landing zone where the Marine troop transport helicopters were to land, inserting the South Vietnamese Marines. Everything was going as planned. Air Force B-52s dropped their bombs. The Navy's cannons shelled the same LZ the Air Force was bombing, and Army Cobra helicopters were flying gun cover for the Marine heavy troop transport helicopters, filled with South Vietnamese Marines and soldiers. As I said, we were untested. One of the CH-53s, a jolly green giant flying at treetop level, suddenly popped up and began climbing for altitude. The giant aircraft was filled with 62 South Vietnamese Marines and loaded with weapons. Why the pilot did what he did, no one knows. All we saw was a jolly green, loaded with troops, struggling to gain altitude. Suddenly a flash and puff of white smoke appeared from the tree line. A tiny rocket twisted and turned, seeking the heat trail from the exhaust of the CH-53. Once the tiny rocket crossed the heat trail, the rocket turned, tracked, flew up the 53's jet engine's exhaust, and exploded. The giant troop transport twisted, banked, and spun into the ground, killing all 62 South Vietnamese Marines and the 4 U.S. Marine crew chiefs and gunners on board. U.S. Army Cobras covered the downed pilots with suppressive fire until Marine CH-46 landed, picked up the 2 pilots, and carried them back to the carrier. Nobody knows why the pilot of the CH-53 popped up. He had nothing to say. He appeared delirious. Following the incident, he was often seen walking the passageways of the ship, shaking his head, mumbling to himself. When our carrier group returned to the Philippines, this pilot was taken off rotation, and a new FNG, fresh from flight school, replaced him. Low-cost technology and low-cost training had defeated the weapons of the most powerful, most expensive, and most well-trained military in world history. Welcome home. 6 months later, in January of 1973, my aircraft taxied up to the gate of North Air Force Base in California. As I have written earlier in this book, we were greeted by thousands of American hippies, throwing eggs at us, spitting on us, calling us baby killers. America's news media had turned America against America. That is the power and the freedom of the press. As Marx warned, democracy is the road to socialism. In the 1960s, men were burning their draft cards, and women were burning their bras. The feminist movement had begun. According to the 2020 U.S. Census Bureau, out of about 11 million single-parent families with children under the age of 18, 80% were headed by single mothers. Most teachers, stats put the percent at about 77% in traditional public schools and charter schools, are women. It's been reported that there are teachers who encourage students to choose their gender at age 5. In the 1960s, a popular TV show was Father Knows Best, starring Robert Young. In the 1980s came Married with Children with Al Bundy, a hapless shoe salesman, as the central male figure. In 1988, Roseanne, starring Roseanne Barr, took the top spot in family sitcoms. In 2020, young men have fewer positive male remodels. This may be why more and more women are saying, there just aren't any men. The feminist movement. In 1963, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, captured the frustration and the despair of a generation of college-educated housewives who felt trapped and unfulfilled. Friedan's writing largely spoke to an audience of educated, upper-middle-class white women. Her work had such an impact that it is credited with sparking the second wave of the American feminist movement, women seeking equality with men. In 2016, Hillary Clinton almost filled that dream. Unfortunately, Donald Trump spoiled the liberal elite's plan of having a black president, Barack Obama, followed by a female president, Hillary Clinton. The liberal elite learned their lesson. The liberal academic elite are very smart. While the Republicans ran Trump and Pence, two white guys, in 2020, the Democrats ran an aging white guy with a powerful black woman, a woman many expect could be the next president. The Democrats are smart. They followed Marx's advice on how to win. As Marx taught, everyone who knows anything of history also knows that great social revolutions are impossible without the feminine ferment. Social progress can be measured exactly by the social position of the fair sex, plain ones included. A key concept of the feminist movement are the words toxic masculinity. Marx would probably agree, as more and more women seem to begin behind those words. Here's a pop quiz. Women say there are three types of men: nice guys, bad boys, wimps. Is Donald Trump a nice guy, a bad boy, or a wimp? What about Joe Biden? Nice guy or bad boy or a wimp? The power of the press. Vogue has been a leading magazine on fashion for over 100 years. Over those 10 decades, they have run a front cover story on every first lady in U.S. history. The July 2021 issue of Vogue featured First Lady Jill Biden, an accomplished and attractive woman, and wife of President Joe Biden. Yet, Vogue snubbed Donald Trump's wife, Melania, who is a beautiful woman and a former model. What are we to make of that fact? Was Marx correct when he wrote about women's upheaval? Should First Lady Melania Trump have graced the cover of Vogue, or has women's power and beauty gone totally political? It makes you wonder if the first husband will be on Vogue's cover. Will Vogue be that elite, that liberal, and that politically correct? Who has killed the most people? One of the favorite quotes of my teacher at the academy was by Victor Hugo, who said, "You have enemies? Good. That means you've stood up for something sometime in your life." In 1992, in the movie A Few Good Men, Jack Nicholson, playing Marine Colonel Nathan Jessup, delivered classic core Marine Corps truths. Jack Nicholson: "You want answers?" Tom Cruise: "I want the truth." Jack Nicholson: "You can't handle the truth." Pause. Jack Nicholson: "Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's going to do it? You? You, Lieutenant Weinberg? I have a greater responsibility than you could possibly fathom. You weep for Santiago, and you curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know, that Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives. And my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth, because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as a backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather you just said, "Thank you," and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand a post. Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you are entitled to. The southern border wall. President Biden and Vice President Harris should have watched this movie before they stopped construction on President Trump's southern border wall, opening the border to anyone, including sex and drug traffickers. On the topic of Trump's wall and America's southern border, it seems the Democrats have taken a page out of Lenin's playbook on how to win elections. Lenin warned, one of the chief symptoms of every revolution is the sharp and sudden increase in the number of ordinary people who take an active, independent, and forceful interest in politics. Are the Democrats opening the southern border to gain more voters? The truth. I'll pose the question again. Who has killed the most people? Socialists? Capitalists? Fascists? Or Marxists? We have all heard of the 6 million Jews Hitler exterminated in his final solution. While tragic, that is not what we were taught in military school. Our economics teacher went further and deeper into the truth. In the Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, and Repression, author Stefan Courtois, Andrei Pachkowski, and Karel Bartasek opened the archives in the former Soviet Union to reveal the truth about socialism, communism, and fascism. Truths many people already knew, but our media refused to report. That book reports on the terror, torture, famine, mass deportations, and massacres in amazing detail. Estimates vary, but communism is responsible for the death of to 100 million people. The book covered Joseph Stalin's Great Purge, Mao's famines, and Pol Pot's killing fields. The authors estimate the deaths by country or region are as follows. China, 65 million deaths. Soviet Union, 20 million deaths. North Korea, 2 million deaths. Cambodia, 2 million deaths. Vietnam, 1 million deaths. Africa, 1.7 million deaths. Afghanistan, 1.5 million deaths. Eastern Europe, 1 million deaths. Latin America, 150,000 deaths. Nazis and the Japanese. Adolf Hitler's Nazis, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, put to death 6 million Jews and an estimated 12 million more minorities, such as Gypsies and Slavs. From the invasion of China in 1937 to the end of World War II, the Japanese military regime murdered between 3 million to over 10 million people, most probably almost 6 million Chinese, Indonesians, Koreans, Filipinos, and Indo-Chinese, among others, including Western prisoners of war. Our politically correct press, teachers, and politicians do not want us to know the truth, which begs a question. Why? Because they can't handle the truth. As Nicholson stated in A Few Good Men, you don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline.